There's a scorched metal sphere sitting on the grassland of Kazakhstan, a little over 2 meters across, trailing a parachute across the dirt behind it. It is the 30th of June, 1971, and the landing has been perfect. Dead center on target, upright, shoots clean, the recovery helicopters down within minutes. The crews run across the grass, pull the hatch open, and lean in to congratulate the 3 men who have just flown the longest space mission in history. And all 3 of them are still strapped into their couches, sitting calmly, and every one of them is dead. And what makes it so hard to take in is how completely the mission had succeeded. For the previous 3.5 weeks, these had been the most celebrated cosmonauts alive. They had flown up to Salyut 1, the first space station ever placed in orbit, and become the very first crew to live aboard it. They stayed up there for 23 days, longer than any human being had ever spent in space, worked through a full program of experiments, and undocked for the trip home. By every signal anyone on the ground could read, right up to the final few minutes, this had been a triumph, from launch to landing. There is not a mark on the ship, nothing failed on the way down. The parachute worked, the engines worked, the computer flew a textbook descent. What killed them was a decision that had been made years earlier, on the ground, by careful people, a decision that everybody involved thought was completely reasonable at the time. And the fix for it, when it finally came, would cost the Soviet space program a third of every crew it flew for almost the next decade. I want to walk you through how something like that happens, because the short version, that a space program strapped 3 people into a capsule with no pressure suits at all, sounds like plain negligence, and the real story is more careful and more human than that. It was a bet that had paid off on every flight for years, right up until this one. There are 4 things you need for this to make sense: the spacecraft and the tiny cabin at the heart of it. What actually happens to a human body when the air leaves the room, the 90-odd seconds in which 3 men died on the way home from a triumph, and the fix, the one that worked, that has kept every crew since alive, and the quiet bill the program paid for it for 9 years. Because this is one of those stories where the system was insane and every single person inside it was being entirely sane. We tend to picture the vacuum of space killing you the way the movies do. You get thrown out the airlock and you freeze solid, or you swell up and burst. Neither of those is really what happens, and the truth is weirder still. The thing that kills you, in a vacuum, is actually your own body. Down here, the air presses on you from every side, about 15 pounds on every square inch, and your body is built to push back against exactly that. Take the pressure away, all at once, and the balance breaks. The gases dissolved in your blood and your tissues, mostly nitrogen, come out of solution, the way the bubbles come out of a soda the instant you crack the cap. The water lining your lungs, coating your tongue, wetting your eyes, starts to boil at body temperature, because the pressure that was keeping it liquid is suddenly gone. Your body does not explode, it fizzes. And here's what happened to the 3 men in a small metal sphere. You do not get a warning and a slow decline. The oxygen already loaded in your blood keeps your brain running for a while, about 15 seconds. For that whole time you are awake, and you know something is very wrong, and you can still move your hands and try to do something about it. Then the oxygen runs out, and you are unconscious, and a minute or so after that, your heart stops. So when I talk about a spacecraft losing its pressure, that is what I mean. It is silent, and it is fast. A few seconds of being awake, and then the lights go out. Hold on to that, because it is going to matter. Now, the room. To understand why 3 men were riding home in cloth suits, you have to look at the cabin they were sitting in. By 1971, the Soviet Union had done something historic. In April, they had launched Salyut 1, the first space station in the history of the world, a place where humans could live and work in orbit for weeks at a stretch. The whole point of it was to be occupied, and to be occupied by a real working crew, not 1 man but 3. A commander, a flight engineer, and a research engineer, enough people to actually run experiments around the clock. 3 was the number that made the station worth having. The trouble was the ride. The spacecraft that carried crews up and back, the Soyuz, returns to Earth in a little bell-shaped capsule called the descent module, and that module is small. We are talking about a cabin with less usable space than the inside of a compact car, and into that you have to fit 3 grown men, their couches, the controls, and the life support. It holds them all. Just barely, the way that same car holds a full back seat of adults, which is to say only if none of them is wearing anything bulky. And a pressure suit is exactly that, bulky. The suits of that era were stiff, heavy, hard to move in, and they took up room the cabin did not have. So somewhere in the design, they made a choice that looks insane, written down, and was, at the time, almost obvious. If you want 3 men, they must fly in shirt sleeves. There is no room for suits, so there are no suits. There was no protection at all for the ride home. The safety margin, the entire safety margin, was the hull itself. If the metal held, the men lived. There was nothing behind it. And I want to be fair here, because the easy version of this story turns these engineers into villains, and the truth is duller and more human. They had done this before, and it had always worked. Back in 1964, the Soviets had flown 3 men in a capsule called Voskhod, also with no suits, for exactly the same reason, because 3 suited men would not fit. It worked. Every crewed Soyuz after that had flown its cosmonauts in shirt sleeves through the dangerous parts, launch and landing, and the cabin had never once lost its air. 7 years of flights, and not a single depressurization. When something has never failed, and the fix for it would mean flying fewer people, or flying no one, you start to treat the risk as theoretical. It was a bet that had paid off every single time it had been placed. Let me put that bet into terms you can feel, because in the abstract it sounds fine, and it was not fine. Imagine an airline that flew for years with no life vests on board. There was a real and defensible logic to it. The planes had never gone down over water. The vests were heavy, they took up space, and every pound of vest was a pound of passenger or cargo the airline would rather carry. So the vests came off, and for years the flights landed safely, and the decision looked smarter. Every year it did not cost anything. Now take that logic and put it 200 kilometers above the Earth, in a cabin smaller than a car, at the single most violent moment of the whole trip. The moment the spacecraft deliberately tears itself into 3 pieces to come home. And understand that up there, unlike on the airline, there is no water landing to survive. If the cabin loses its air, the 15 seconds start, and there is no tomorrow, no waited out, no second attempt. The part I cannot get out of my head about Soyuz 11 is that the men had just enough time to understand exactly what was happening, and not nearly enough time to stop it. Here is what actually happened on the way down. The descent was fully automatic, and it was going perfectly. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev strapped into their couches while the computer flew them home. And then, at an altitude of about 168 kilometers, still well above the atmosphere, the spacecraft did the normal thing it was supposed to do. Small explosive charges fired to separate the descent module from the rest of the ship. The shock of that separation forced a valve open. It was a pressure equalization valve, a little vent near the top of the cabin whose whole job is to open low in the atmosphere, at about 4 kilometers up, to let outside air in before landing so the pressures match. It should never have opened in space, but the jolt of the charges popped it, and it opened onto the vacuum, and the air in the cabin started pouring out through a hole the men could not immediately see. The gauge began to fall. There was a whistle of escaping air, and the 15 seconds started. One of the cosmonauts, from the position they later found his body in, had unstrapped himself and reached for the valve, trying to find it and crank it shut by hand. The problem is that closing that valve by hand takes time. After the accident, the commander who had been bumped from this very crew tried it himself on the ground, calmly, knowing exactly where it was, and it took him the better part of a minute. These men were losing consciousness in about 15 seconds, in the dark, unsure even where the leak was. They never had a chance. The cabin reached vacuum in under 2 minutes, and by then, all 3 of them were gone. It came down under a perfect parachute, on a perfect trajectory, and landed dead center, 3 dead men in a spacecraft that had done almost everything right. Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev are to this day the only human beings who have ever died in space itself, past the line where the atmosphere gives out. Every other death in the history of spaceflight has happened down inside the air, on the pad, or on the way home. Theirs is the only one that happened on the far side of that line, and more than 50 years later, it still is. The Soviet program stopped. For over 2 years, no cosmonaut went to space at all, while the engineers tore into the problem, and the fix they arrived at is the reason this is not just a tragedy, but a story about how systems change. The first fix is obvious. Put a pressure suit back on the crew for the dangerous parts of the flight, launch and landing, so that if the cabin ever loses its air again, each person is inside their own little sealed bubble of pressure, and they have not 15 seconds but hours. To do that, they built a new suit from scratch, called the Sokol. Lightweight, soft, quick to seal, designed for exactly this and nothing else. and they built it fast, with the first version ready within months. But a suit takes up room, and we already know the cabin did not have any. So the second half of the fix is the part I find truly remarkable, because it is the opposite of what you would expect an engineering team to do. They did not find a way to cram the suits in. They took a man off the ship. They cut the crew from 3 to 2. The redesigned Soyuz flew 2 cosmonauts, both suited, and the space where the third crew member used to sit was given over to the suits and the extra life support the suits required. They had said there was no room for a suit, so they solved it by flying 1 fewer person. That isn't easy for an organization to choose, to give up a third of its own crew on purpose. And they chose it, and it worked. When the Soviets came back to space, in September 1973, it was 2 men in a Soyuz. Both of them zipped into Sokol suits for the ride up and the ride down. And from that day to this one, it has held. Here is what the fix bought, and I will keep this short, because the good news is not really the point of the story. No one has died of decompression in space since 1971, not a single cosmonaut or astronaut of any nation. Every crew that has launched or landed in a Soyuz for more than 50 years has done it in a sealed pressure suit, and that includes every American astronaut who rode a Soyuz to the station in the years the United States had no rocket of its own. The Sokol suit that a NASA astronaut zips up today is a direct descendant of the one the Soviets built in a hurry in 1972, and the principle spread. The idea that a crew wears a real pressure suit through launch and re-entry, the violent parts, is now simply how human spaceflight is done everywhere. The United States learned the same lesson its own hard way and put its shuttle astronauts back into pressure suits for ascent and entry too. Everybody copied it, which is exactly why this tragedy was worth talking about. Because when everybody adopts a fix, its hidden price stops being one country's problem and becomes the standard. So let me talk about the part almost nobody tells you. For every crewed flight, the redesign meant 1 fewer human being in orbit, and there was no clever way around it. The volume the third person used to occupy was now physically full of suits and life support, and you cannot fold a cosmonaut into the space that is left. The spacecraft that was built to carry 3 now carried 2, and it carried 2 for a long, long time. Think about what that meant for the whole reason Soyuz existed. Its job was to service the space stations, the Salyut program, a string of orbital labs the Soviets ran through the 1970s, and for years, those stations, the whole point of the exercise, were crewed 2 at a time instead of 3. Every mission that might have carried a third specialist, a doctor, an extra engineer, a scientist for one more discipline, flew without them. The science that a third pair of hands would have done did not get done, or got deferred, or got squeezed into the schedule of 2 exhausted men already running the station around the clock. And 2 is a more fragile number than it looks. A crew of 3 carries a little redundancy in it. One person can fall ill, or lose a whole day fighting a broken system, and the other 2 keep the station running. 2 has no such slack. If one cosmonaut is down, you are effectively down to 1, and a space station is a lot of machine for one tired person to handle alone. So the cost went beyond the science that a third specialist would have done. It was also the margin that a third body gives you when something goes wrong, and for 9 years that margin was simply gone, and it went on for nearly a decade. 3 cosmonauts did not fly together again until November 1980 on a mission called Soyuz T3, more than 9 years after the accident. It took that long to redesign the spacecraft yet again and improve the suits enough to finally fit 3 suited people into a cabin that had once held 3 bare ones. Now, you can argue about whether that price was necessary, and thoughtful people do, and I want to give you both sides honestly because I do not think one of them cleanly wins. On one side, the objection is sharp. The thing that actually killed those men was a single cheap valve that popped open at the wrong moment. That is all. Fix the valve, latch it, redesign that one component so a separation shock cannot jar it open, and the men fly home alive with no suits and no crew cuts at all. From that angle, throwing out the third seat and retooling the entire spacecraft for 9 years was a wild overcorrection for one bad part. You did not need suits, you needed a better valve. On the other side, the valve was one of 100 ways a hull can breach: a cracked seal, a micrometeoroid, a bad weld, a hatch that did not seat quite right. Fix the valve, and you have closed exactly one of those doors and left all the others open. Put the crew in suits, and you close the entire category at once, permanently, including the failure nobody has thought of yet. The men died because there was nothing at all between their bodies and the vacuum. And the only thing that truly changes that is a suit. Everything else is patching holes one at a time and hoping you found them all. Both of those are true. I am not going to stand here and pretend one or the other wins, because the people who actually lived this disagreed at the time, and they still disagree now. So the real tally has entries on both sides. Crews are alive, and have been for half a century, and nobody has died that way again. But for 9 years the program flew short-handed, did less than it was designed to do, flight after flight. And there is one more loss, and it is the one that stays with me. Salyut 1. The first space station ever built, the thing the whole mission was for. When its only crew died coming home from it, the Soyuz that was meant to carry the next crew up was grounded, torn apart for the redesign, and there was suddenly no spacecraft in the world that could reach the station. So it just circled up there, empty. The greatest achievement the program had, with no one able to go to it. And a few months later, on the 11th of October, 1971, ground control fired its engines one last time and dropped it into the Pacific Ocean on purpose, and it burned up on the way down. The first space station in history hosted exactly one crew for 23 days, and then it was deliberately destroyed, and no suit and no redesign could ever change that. The mechanism there is not a mystery. There was simply no way to reach it, and no reason to keep a failing station in orbit indefinitely. But it is hard to sit with. The men were dead. The station they had died coming home from was dropped into the ocean within the year, and what the program carried forward from all of it was a suit and a smaller crew. So let me be straight about what this whole story actually adds up to, because it is not the tidy win that a headline like 50 years without a death makes it sound like. By any fair measure, the redesign was a success. It solved the problem it set out to solve, and it has kept solving it for longer than most of the people watching this have been alive. The suits work, but success here was never about getting anything back. It was about accepting a smaller, more careful version of the thing and calling that a win, because the alternative was worse. The third seat was gone for 9 years. The first space station burned up over the Pacific within months, and the 3 men were never coming back at all. They figured out how to bring crews home alive, and how to never again fly a human being with nothing but cloth between them and the vacuum. What they could not do was learn it about a month sooner, in time for the only 3 men it would ever have saved. So the next time you watch a crew launch to the space station, and there is almost always one you can pull up on a stream from Kazakhstan, do not skip to the rocket. Watch the part before, in the quiet room, where technicians zip each person into a soft white Sokol suit and pressure test it before they will let anyone near the spacecraft. It is the answer to the tiny cabin, and to the valve that jarred open, and to the 15 seconds, and its whole existence traces back in an unbroken line to 3 men who flew the longest mission in history and came home looking, for all the world, like they had simply fallen asleep. That suit, and the empty seat beside it, are what a fix looks like when it comes with a real bill attached. Almost every advance in spaceflight has one like that behind it, a cost paid quietly, long after the disaster that forced it, and it is usually the part that never makes the story. The cost side is what I keep coming back for on this channel, as much as the triumph. Subscribe, and you will not miss the next one.